Hi, everyone. My name is Alexandria Martin, and welcome to Frank Fridays. Frank Fridays is really us having a candid conversation about the things that are important to members of the United Teachers of Day bargaining unit. These conversations will be candid, and I definitely want to hear your feedback. So let's jump right into the first one. At last week's school board meeting, there was a conversation surrounding the renewal of the Teach for America contract. And in that conversation was a larger conversation, I think, about new hires and surplus personnel. And Dr. Steve Gallen at the last school board meeting really dived in on what the United Teachers of Day contract says about surplus. And if you remember from yesterday's post dealing with our contract language on surplus, he dives directly into that same conversation about what does the contract say about surplus personnel. So let's listen into what he says about that.
These contract provisions state X, but your actions seek to do Y. So could you speak to any concerns or any contemplations relative to the contractual provision that says thou shalt not hire new teachers until existing teachers have been stabilized and placed versus what we have before us?
So as we can see, Dr. Steve Gallen is really having that larger conversation about the fact that surplus personnel take priority over new hires. And how can we, whether it's TFA or not, how can we hire anyone if we have surplus personnel just, displaced within our school district? So the head of labor relations responds to Steve Gallen's commentary, and let's hear what she says.
TFA core members coming on board for this coming school year. I stated that the majority of them are in secondary schools, and that is not where we have a tremendous number of our surplus teachers, right? And so you will do and we will engage in specific hiring practices for areas where we will need teachers despite the fact that we may have additional surplus, because we may not have surplus in those areas. And that will be our job to go through with human capital, through school principals, with coordination with the region, to make sure that we're placing people appropriately, right? And so for their certification in order to meet the needs of the schools.
Thank you. Let me be very, very clear. I'm clear on the distinction between the RIF and a surplus.
Correct.
But the contractual language speaks to a teacher won't even be surplused, and they have a right to a position before a new hire is assigned. So let me make it plain. The contract stipulates something to the effect of, if I'm a ninth grade English teacher and I'm being surplused, then the district can't hire a new teacher to teach ninth grade for that particular position. And I think that is one of the concerns that have. I don't anticipate issues relative to a RIF. I get the difference between a RIF and for the listening public, that's a reduction of force. That's where people do not have jobs. Surplus is where they're assigned to a different work location. So how have we reconciled that particular provision?
So just to summarize what Don Bagalow said from Labor Relations, the gist of it is she mentions earlier on, which I don't capture, and she says we're not going to have a RIF, that our superintendent's promised that teachers will not be displaced in that manner. And really TFA is being placed in high needs high schools and not taking any positions away from surplus personnel. And that's her response to that. But Steve Gallen wasn't really having that. He kind of dug in and kind of reiterated the UTD contract and what the contract says. So he gives a bit of a pushback, and the superintendent kind of chimes in and offers this statement.
So I use Pinecrest because Pinecrest is not a school that would receive a TFA teacher. And I used it specifically to say that's a school that will lose FTE. Probably there will be some surplus. No TFA teacher is going to go there for two reasons. Number one, that school would not be eligible. And number two, it is a realignment to actually the head count of students that are going there. Now, if I'm to speak of another school that usually receives TFA teachers, let's say Booker T. Washington Senior High School, FTE may go down at Booker T. Washington Senior High School. There may be, I know for a fact, there are TFA teachers assigned to Booker T. Washington right now. that school may actually get surplus from other schools that were not TFA, and yes, may still get a TFA, because the use of the resources this year needs to be one that clearly advantages the schools whose performance and fragility is at a premium.
Thank you, Mr. Superintendent. And you.
The superintendent's response, a couple of things stuck out to me. The cross comparison between Pinecrest and Booker T, and how Pinecrest would not get a TFA because it's not an academically fragile school, but Booker T would because it's an academically fragile school, that they would get a new hire. They would get a TFA, Teach for America, more than likely, because the school site principal would choose a Teach for America new hire as opposed to a traditional new hire, that was out the mouth of the superintendent. And that stuck with me because that conversation regarding fragile schools and how we hire for those schools really, for me, might be a larger conversation around, does this have anything to do with why they're fragile schools? But that's a conversation for another day. But for the purposes of this platform, just the value in the United Teachers of Date contract when it comes to surplus, and how surplus personnel take priority over new hires, period. That they should be placed first. And the question I guess I want to ask you guys is, if you know any surplus personnel, are they being placed? Because in the part of this conversation, they were saying that there's 60 TFA personnel that are being trained currently, that are probably figuring out what school sites they're going to be placed in at some point in the not so distant future. And for our surplus personnel, are they being placed? When do they get placed? Are they placed right before the school year begins and randomly placed into schools without enough preparation time to be successful? Or, are they learning that they're being surplused early on and have ample time to select a school that will be best suiting for them? But the UTD contract speaks to surplus personnel must be placed before new hires. That's powerful language. So thank you for participating in the first Frank Friday. I hope you found that information useful, and maybe you can engage me as to what we could talk about in the future. But thanks again, and once again, I'm Alexandra Martin, and welcome to Frank Fridays.